Good day, fellow champions of inclusion. I am A.A. Ron, and this is the Inclusive Dad Podcast, where we explore inclusion and make it practical. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe, rate, or review the show on your favorite platform. We truly appreciate your feedback and would be honored if you shared the podcast with friends and family who might benefit. Today, my guest is Dr. Cheryl Blankman. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm so honored to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. Why don't you start it off by telling me a little bit about who you are?
Oh, okay. My uh, relationship with inclusivity and education goes way, way back. But I started my career over a quarter century ago as a school psychologist, and I am a nationally certified school psychologist. Worked in public education in a number of different states and big districts and small districts. And then decided, to make my way from school psychologist up to the administrative tier. So I worked as a director of special education, director of special services for many years. And now I have made a new transition to adjunct professor. And I am with the Masters of Special Education program for Ramapo College of New Jersey. So I'm out on the East Coast. And I spend a good bit of my time working with individual school districts and organizations, all in the interest of fostering more inclusive environments and inclusivity in education. So
That's
that's kind of my nutshell.
that's awesome. The next question I want to ask is, what is your one of the things I ask when people apply to me on the podcast is, what is your definition of inclusion?
So, such a great question. I'm going to have to make sure that I subscribe so I can hear every single guest's
There you go.
definition of inclusion. Um, to me, inclusivity is equity, period. Inclusivity is equity. And interesting to me, well, I hope it's interesting to listeners. When I am invited to speak or when I'm invited for a training, one of the things I've been talking about just in recent months is I think it's important that we take a look at our language and make a little bit of a shift from the word inclusion to talking about inclusivity. And the difference for me, and maybe other people will disagree, and I welcome the conversation. The difference for me is inclusion sounds like something we do, right? We do inclusion here. This is our inclusion classroom, right? Inclusivity to me sounds like something we are. We are an inclusive community. Okay, we are an inclusive school. And where to me, inclusivity equals equity, I think that using the language of inclusivity is, if that's a message that I can help to spread, that's a priority for me for right now.
That's great. I love that. How did you get from that shift from talking about inclusion to inclusivity? What prompted that?
I love that you asked me that. Thank you for that pathway. Um, it is as I started to understand that the ways that we think about inclusivity um, are very much dependent on or a function of the ways that we think about disability. And this for me, some of this is relatively new learning within the last year and a half from reading and investigating and exploring. But what I've learned is that there are different lenses of disability, right? And our most of our system, certainly our educational system, is built on a medical lens. We look at disability as being, something that's inherent within the person. They take it with them wherever they go. We focus on trying to fix it. We want people with disabilities to better fit into our world around them, right? And it turns out that there's other options for how we conceptualize disability that then become new frames, new ways of perceiving or thinking about inclusivity.
Right.
And so the one that has captured me right now that I've been learning the most about is the social model of disability,
Yep.
which has actually been around for a really long time,
Right. Yep.
but not maybe gotten the kind of airtime that it deserves in conversation and understanding. And the social model kind of moves the idea of where disability lives from inside the person
Right.
to the space between an individual and the environment around them.
Right.
And it requires us, or it asks of us, that we all share responsibility for creating environments that are inclusive, making an inclusive world. That people have impairments, nobody's denying that impairments exist. But how much an impairment becomes a disability is absolutely about the environment where we are, right?
Yes.
So,
Absolutely.
easiest
Yes.
example oftentimes is somebody who's using a wheelchair for mobility. And if they are on a flat surface or somewhere where there's, ramp access and they're able to maneuver, impairment, tool, not disabled, right?
Right.
Able to access what they want to access. Take the exact same person with the exact same impairment using the same tools and technology in an environment where there's no ramps, there's no elevator, and we've
Right.
now created a disabling condition.
Right.
And we do the same thing in our classrooms, we do the same thing in our schools. So when we can all decide that inclusivity is everybody's job, and we democratize that responsibility as leaders and as educators, we get different environments that create better access and more equity.
Awesome. That's great. Wow. My brain is going all over the place. You're hitting on all the good stuff.
Too
So I'm
much,
trying to
too
figure.
fast.
No,
I
no,
get
no. It's
excited.
great.
I get excited, and then I talk
No,
quick.
yeah. No, that's awesome. So a little bit about my story, which I'm not sure if know much about my stories. I didn't know anything about disability, special education, before my daughter was born. So my daughter Cecilia was born in 2002. 3 months after she was born, we found out she was having seizures, diagnosed with epilepsy, subsequently diagnosed with cerebral palsy. So she qualified for services early childhood, probably around age 3, I think, if I remember correctly. So she's always been in special education. Since I didn't know anything about it, I just kind of went along with what the school was
Mm-hmm.
telling me. Didn't know any better, which meant that because by the time she was going to school, she was using a wheelchair. She qualifies as severely multiply impaired for an IEP, so she's hits lots of different categories. So because of all of that, they sent her to the segregated classroom across town. So she was bused on the special ed bus over there. Found out early on. I went to visit her for lunch. Kids were folding towels, and we're talking. She was in kindergarten, first, second grade, and I was like, "Why is everybody folding towels already? This seems. Why aren't they in math class or reading?" Found out about inclusion. So for me, my, I mean, I need to come up with a good definition of inclusion because for me, inclusion means like full inclusion, like she's fully
Mm-hmm.
included with her school. And part of the issue that we had once we found out about inclusion was now she's out of the general education classroom. Trying to get her back in there seemed like now there was more hoops to jump through than there would have been if she would have
Yep.
gone there first of all. So it was a long process of going to IP meetings, talking about
Mm-hmm.
inclusion. Let's add this one thing. Now we
Mm-hmm.
gotta try that for a period of time. Let's add another thing. So by the time she got to high school, I believe she was only going out of the gen ed classroom for just like reading and math minutes. Otherwise, she was in there in fully included, which is good. Um, that was a lot of information to talk about. As part of what I want to talk about on my podcast is, so, you know, we hear the word inclusion, try to make it practical. So, in order to make it practical, for me as a parent, I'm in a district where um, the special ed director now it was for my daughter's case manager early on. So we've known each other her whole
Yeah.
schooling career. Great person. We have different definitions of what inclusion means, though.
Mm-hmm.
So as a parent in a district, and we're in a town of around 25,000, there are small districts 15 to 20 minutes away, but a parent in my situation where, we don't see eye to eye on the definition of inclusion, which means there's always kind of this back and forth.
Mhm.
To get her fully included, do you have any tips for parents on if you are in that situation,
Yeah.
since you worked in the school system, on
So
how to get more inclusion?
I think I love that question, and you just described probably the most common set of experiences for families with children who do find themselves eligible and in need of special education and maybe related services as well. And you also just described perfectly how our system's built with this medical model thinking, right?
Yep.
Is
Yep.
when she's ready, we'll give her more access,
Yep.
as opposed to we will create a more accessible environment because it's our job to make the environment ready for her,
Right.
right? And something that sometimes comes as a surprise is that IDEA, which is the federal law, of course, that underscores all of our special education programming, across the states. And then every state, of course, has its own code, and you have to know your own code, right? State by state. Even it's amazing how different things can be for something that's based on federal
Yep.
legislation,
For sure.
right? The interpretations and things. But IDEA does speak to the fact that students are supposed to be with their general education peers in the most inclusive environment they possibly can be educated within, right? So
Yep.
that's the premise there. And part of that conversation is sitting down as a team, and instead of saying to ourselves, what is the student ready for? Being able to ask those questions from the other way around, to say, what would it take? What would we need in the environment for the environment to be ready for the student, right? And the other thing that sometimes IEP teams, particularly, now any member of the IEP team can have, some misconceptions or misunderstandings about lots of things. Students who require special education programs and services are allowed to have different experiences. It's okay if the meaningful gain, it's okay if their growth and progress in that general education inclusive environment is different
Right.
from a more typically developing peer,
Yep.
right? Or from other students with other individualized programs. It doesn't all need to be the same. But sometimes we have to give ourselves permission for that. So I think it's really important for parents to know. I mean, in the state of New Jersey and Pennsylvania as well, and I'm sure that there are state by state, kind of a parent guide to special education that your Department of Education has probably created, right? But there's something to be said for reading the actual code.
Right.
And just know, because that's what schools and districts are trying to adhere to, right? But we also have to understand that that kind of compliance is the floor, not the ceiling.
Yeah.
And, it's tough because we use words like an appropriate program. Well, what could be grayer than the word appropriate, right?
Right. Yeah.
But I think you described something, Aaron, that's so important as well, and that's just the relationships.
Yep.
Everything's going to happen based on our relationships, based on our understandings of one another. And so I think for parents to have some sense of what they want for their child, to as much as you can, depending on the age of your child and the needs of your child, to know what your child's goals are, what your child's dreams are, and to be able to ground conversations with the educators who are responsible for helping your child to reach those things, to make sure that they understand what we're going for here,
Right.
and how important every little bit of time is, and that depending again on each child's individual needs, what will success mean to you? What will success mean for that child? And let's talk then about, again, what the environment would need to look like,
Absolutely.
not what the child needs to gain before they can have that,
Right.
right? I want to just one more thing that I kind of want to say
Sure.
about that, and that is, this is also something that when I'm honored and to be invited to speak or for trainings, professional learning trainings, and working with administrative teams. In the summer, that's
Yep.
administrative time, right? So my summer I spend more with the administrators than with the teachers. Um, but I lost my train. I'm gonna have to come back to it.
That's
I'm
okay.
so sorry. I hate when the rails go. The older I get, the train goes off the tracks sometimes, Aaron.
It happens, yeah. No, but that's a great point. I've listened to, I think, Dr. Shelley Moore.
Oh,
You've probably
yes.
heard of Dr. Shelley Moore. One of the things I think she came up with in her doctor's thesis was just, making the like universal design, making designing spaces to be accessible for everybody from the
Yes.
start. That way you don't have to modify it later, which to me is a great idea.
Yes.
So yeah, my daughter's in a wheelchair, like I said, and what you talked about is just how the society makes creates the disability for her. Just we're talking ADA was 1991, I think. There's still sidewalks that don't have curb cuts, still buildings without accessible entrances. So just that piece of it is hard. The school, I mean, for her, she was in a wheelchair, so just having desks in the room that she can pull up to, get her chair under in the room that are by kids. I mean, that was one thing. So she
Hmm.
had would have a desk, but hers would be over in the corner because she was the only one that used it. So then she's not by the other kids. So just things like that where, um, I mean, she should be able to get to a desk, that kind of thing. So just making it accessible
Yes.
for her as well. So that's great stuff. Um, so what was your, like I talked a little bit about, I didn't know anything about disability or special education before she was born. How did you, I mean, you said you were a school psychologist. How
Hmm.
did you decide to like go into that field, or what made you want to do that?
So I I started out in psychology. I
Okay.
have my bachelor's degree is a degree in psychology. As far back as I could remember, one of the questions that I most wanted to understand is how we become who we are. Um, why am I me and not somebody else? Right? How is it that I belong? My mind belongs to me, and other people have all these other lives, and their minds belong to them. And how does all of that work? And so I went into psychology really wanting to understand what I didn't know at the time is the human development, right?
Right.
Um, and so I'm finishing my bachelor's degree. Shout out to Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And I know that I need to continue my education. I want to continue my education. I'm
Right.
not done learning. I haven't answered that question. Um, but I also realized that at the time, it was really important to me to be a practitioner, that I wanted to be working with people, in a very practical way, day to day, which, as fascinating as the world of academia was,
Right.
that wasn't my path at the time. And so school psychology became, kind of the center of this Venn diagram for me
Yep.
between learning and development, human development, and the ability to be part of an organization
Yep.
where we're all working together to really do things, right? To really do
Right.
things.
That's awesome.
And so that that took me, on this path now. And while you were speaking about your daughter and your experiences getting her into the classroom and things like literally the physical setup of the
Yep.
classroom, set aside any of the learning, you put my train back on track.
There you go.
So I thank you for that. And
You're
here's
welcome.
the thing that I wanted to layer on to this conversation for parents. And again, something I say in speaking and training all the time. Um, every single child who's part of the community who's going to access those public schools, whatever they may be, every child who's part of that community is entitled, it's egalitarian, they're entitled to all that, whatever that public school system has to offer, right? You're not entitled to different parts of it when you walk in the door. When we all walk in the door together, we're all entitled to all the same stuff. Yep. And one of the things that happens sometimes is there's this kind of misframe that somehow when a child is found eligible for special education and we put an IEP together, that somehow it is supplanting things that are part of that foundational entitlement that everybody has. And that's not how it works. At no point does a child or a family abdicate their entitlement to everything that everybody in that community is entitled to. Right. What that IEP does, what that conversation does, is it's an agreement between the family and the school team that says, we all agree that in order to get all that stuff, yep, in order to access all that stuff, there's more that's required for this right. child. And so now they're entitled to that. But we didn't give anything up, right? So sure. When we think about inclusivity, at no point have we abdicated that right to inclusivity. It is admittedly more complicated. Yeah. And honestly, for some students, we may all sit down and agree that some kind of small group or one-on-one instruction will be appropriate and beneficial. And for some period of time, we might want to do that. You know, IEP teams can make those decisions. It's just about that mindset when we sit down to have the conversation.
For sure. Yeah. Something you talked about a while back was about how, you know, talking to your child, figuring out what their goals are. That's something I talk about also, is like families sitting down and figuring out like what is the goal or what is the plan for your child. Talk to your child. What do you want to be? What is your goals? And then having that written down, bringing that with you to the IEP meetings. Just don't let the school tell you what your child, what their dream of their life is about. Figure that out for yourselves and then, you know, work towards that. So, I mean, that was a great thing you mentioned that I wanted to bring back up. I mean, like I said, I didn't know anything about it. So you kind of go along with what the school says. And, mm-hmm. you know, parents, also another thing I talk about is, as a parent, if something in your gut, they say something or something doesn't feel right, I mean, first ask questions. I mean, mm-hmm. sometimes they might not like that you're asking the questions, but you're a parent. If you feel something, ask questions, bring it up, you know, get it out there. I mean, that's something very important for you to do. I've done 2 TEDx talks. The most recent one I did this year, I started talking more about how we can use empathy to be more inclusive. Like, how do you think empathy can be used to make a school in particular more inclusive?
That's such a great question, and such an important, again, just an important skill set for everyone, right? Mm-hmm. But I think that some of that goes back to this conversation about who's responsible for all of these environments. Who's responsible? When I say democratizing the responsibility, you know, it's making it shared, making it for all of us, and you know, and keeping in mind, not for nothing, but you referenced, and I'm a super fan of Shelley Moore.
Yeah.
So guys, if you don't know, like, YouTube 5 more minutes, Moore, like go look, right? But oh, I did it again. We talk about the importance of that universal design. Yep. Right. And this idea that there's lots of things. First of all, we all come in with all kinds of variability. We all come in with all kinds of profiles. That's the UDL, Universal Design for Learning, you know, foundation. So one of the things that comes out of that is stuff that might be really important or necessary for some of our students or one of our students can turn out to be really helpful and useful. Yes. For lots and lots of people. You talked about ADA, right? And any one of us who's ever tried to get a stroller up a curb
Yep,
can appreciate how great it is to have that cutout, right?
for
But
sure.
that's something that is all from disability advocacy and things like the Americans with Disabilities Act
Yep.
requiring that communities become more accessible. And the same thing is true in education. And so when we start to think about it in terms of all the benefits to everyone in the community, and we can be appreciative for each individual for what they bring to the table, both in how we value one another, but also in how we understand one another and how that can lead us to the how we want to create that environment together. I think empathy is at the heart of inclusivity and equity.
This question has popped into my mind, so hopefully it's not too much of a curveball. Can you, over your experience, do you have a story about a student or situation at a school where you were able to help make it more inclusive for either the school in general or the student, and what happened because of that?
So, I would like to think that I have thousands of those stories, but some of them, you'd have to get from it would be up
Yeah.
to the families, I guess, to make that judgment call or not. Um, but, but a couple things. Yes. I mean, many years ago, was working in a school district, that where we were working on becoming more inclusive ourselves, right? This has
Sure.
been an
Yep.
ongoing conversation, and it's a challenge for the schools just like it's a challenge for families.
Hmm.
And so it's all a work in progress no matter where we go. But similar to some of what you've described, I was a case manager at the time, and one of the students on my caseload was a young woman with Down syndrome. And historically, um, the school programming would have, I was fairly new, to my role in my position, but
Yep.
would have kind of looked at her profile of need and said, we're gonna look towards more of a functional program, right? A
Yep.
life skills program, self-contained program, something like that. And in sitting and talking with her parents, who wanted the most inclusive, most challenging, presuming competence, which at the time they understood better than I did.
Right.
Um, Having that conversation with her parents, talking about long-term goals and thinking about backward designing from those long-term goals, they said something that really shifted my thinking and stuck with me, which was this idea that you only get one time to kind of go through your education, right? Like
Hmm.
if you're going into eighth grade, you go to eighth grade, and that's your year in eighth grade. And despite the nightmares that some of us might have about somebody finding us 30 years later and telling us we didn't actually pass that English class and we're going to have to go back to high school and
Yep.
redo something, right? Um, we all get one shot at it.
Right.
And what they messaged to me, what I took from the conversation was this idea that, you know, she's going to be a person with Down syndrome, which is going to, in no small part, shape a lot of her life for her whole life, right? But she gets one shot to go to middle school, one
Hmm.
shot to go to high school. And so their desire for her was to have the most typical experience she could,
Hmm.
right? And some of the other things that we were worried about were not their highest priorities at the time. And they kind of had a, we'll worry about that later. Like she can fold towels when she's 20,
Right.
right? And so that really shifted the whole conversation. It was a real wake up learning moment for me. And then as the case manager, my role is to be custodian of the program and to guide through this process and facilitate, these meetings. And so we as an IEP team had a shift in the way that we were thinking about programming, understanding the goals,
Yep.
and we created much more inclusive programming for her that did then require training. It required working with our teachers. It required shifting some resources,
Hmm.
so that we could provide her with the experience she deserved. But that conversation with her parents was one of those moments in my life that changed the way that I perceived forever, right? Like I was never going back
Yeah,
to before that understanding after having that conversation.
that's great.
So
I love
one
that.
example.
I love that. The next couple more questions here. The next one I want to ask you is, well, talk about a little bit is, for me, like evaluations or all the assessments involved with that were not a fun for me. My daughter has cerebral palsy and she's verbal, but like I understand her. But if you meet her for the first time, it's going to be hard to understand her. So a lot of the tests that are done during the evaluation process, I mean, they can't be modified, otherwise the results aren't valid. So most of the time when she was tested, her scores were super low, and as a parent, that's, I mean, you don't like
Yep.
to see low scores. But for me, I didn't put a lot of weight to them in my mind. I mean, for me, the evaluation was, as her dad was for there to, for her to qualify for services, and I didn't like see it beyond that, because
Hmm.
I was like, she needs to qualify for services. Great, now let's use the IP to get what she needs.
Yeah.
But for me, like, I also knew that there were situations in our day to day where we're playing Monopoly or Uno or something, and she throws out a sentence, uses a huge, complicated word I've never heard her use before, and she uses it in context. So in the back of my mind, I was like, okay, so that's also why I didn't put a lot of weight into, the test scores, because just like she's using words that I've never heard her use before. So I just always viewed the test as that's not the true
Hmm.
indicator of her abilities. Can you speak to that a little bit, as about that evaluations tests, and like how parents, maybe some tips on how to view those that aren't as negative as they could be?
So you've described something that, again, I think is a pretty common experience if we were to go from family to family and ask about that. And again, every state is different, so
Yep.
the requirements, and even from school district to school district,
Right.
what the school district is using
Sure. Yep.
for evaluations and for eligibility determinations can really vary, right?
Yep.
We always want the most accurate information we can possibly get.
Yep.
And, we continue to evolve just like everything else. But we also recognize that, sometimes an assessment isn't going to be the most accessible
Yep.
assessment for a child.
Mm-hmm.
And, when we know that as practitioners, we try to build that conversation in, right? Like,
Yeah.
the report may actually say, so I've written, that report that has said, this information is useful, but this information maybe not so much, and we want to be
Right.
careful about the interpretation because XYZ.
Awesome.
Um, and so, the assessments are as good as they can be, and that
Mm-hmm.
may or may not for any individual child capture everything that we wish that it would capture. But I think that you said something really important, that is the focus for parents, which is much more about programming,
Yep.
right? So when we are looking at developing programming, when we're looking at goals, what's really important there may not be a standardized measure of assessment per se. It may be progress monitoring data. It may be classroom based assessment or benchmark assessment. Like there's all kinds of data that we have available to us. And I think that you make a good point in kind of saying there's some kinds of data that maybe a school or state or somebody needs, says
Yep.
important for accessing programs and services. There may be some other data that has more utility for us
Right.
when we sit down to look at what an individual child's program is going to look like, and how we're going to provide what interventions and what resources and strategies are going to be the most impactful.
Awesome.
So
That's
I
great.
hope that helps.
Absolutely. Another thing I talked about in my most recent TEDx talk is just how I viewed inclusion as I want my daughter to be more included. I'd go to school, hey, make her programming more inclusive. And then when they said no, I'd get upset about it and kind of focus. I'd have anger towards the school for not doing what I wanted. And I realized that's not a good way to approach it. So I'm switching to more like myself. What is something I can do today to make the world more inclusive, and trying to do little things myself, spreading that message so everybody's doing little things that are more inclusive. What's one tip you could share for the listeners that would help start them to be more inclusive today?
Oh, that's a great and tough question. I think the conversations, like you're sitting here talking about, what's something I could do on your podcast, as somebody who does serve that role, one as being a resource, but also as being a messenger, right? At the beginning, I heard you use the word champion, which also I think is what we need to be. I think when you're willing to share your stories, and when you're willing to be part of a larger community, all of those things. But I also think even with our as parents, and in our relationships with our school communities, or other, maybe other aspects of your community, whether it's a religious thing or a community center or library, whatever it might be, um, being part of that community
Right. Yep.
gives other people the opportunity to be present for those conversations, to be engaged. And so just being willing to get out and be participatory, I think, is really important. But also, it's all relationships, right? I
Right.
feel like we might have said that back from the very beginning, but even with
For
our
sure.
with our school teams, right? It's tough. Year to year, you get new teachers.
Yep.
Maybe you have a new case manager every year. I don't know. But the
Yep.
team keeps changing. And then, it can get frustrating because it took them 6 months to get to know your child really well.
Yep.
And then you have a couple months together, and then the team is going to change.
Yep.
And it is exhausting sometimes and frustrating for parents to feel like, how do you ever feel like you're getting anywhere if you feel
Right.
like you're always starting over, right?
Yes.
But the relationships are so important. And so take the initiative. So if you're working with a case manager in a school district, might have 75 to 100 students that they are responsible for, right?
Hmm.
Be the parent who reaches out and says, can I get 15-20 minutes on your calendar? I'd like for us to know one another. Create pathways of communication. Make sure that the people who are working with your child, they know that they can reach you, that they can
Absolutely.
speak to
Yep.
you, that they can ask questions of you, and get to know them, so that when you do go for parent conferences, when you do go for those IEP meetings, you're coming together as more of a team with some relationships that are already, foundationally intact. It's better for everyone. Is
Absolutely.
it always going to work? But you'll never go wrong in giving a team the opportunity to earn your trust and
Yep.
to develop trust. And you'll never go wrong trying to establish those relationships in the interest of your child. And
Absolutely.
you know
Yeah.
what? Get involved. Be a part of the parent advocacy group.
Right. For sure.
Be a voice.
Yeah. That's all great stuff. Thank you very much. I have one more question for you. Ready for the question I ask everybody
I
at
hope
the end?
so.
Okay. Do you like spam? Yes or no?
I'm pescatarian.
What
Sorry,
I'm
man.
No. Okay. Can you explain what that means? I'm not familiar with
Yeah.
spam.
So, I mean, I don't want to offend. I should be careful. There might be truer pescatarians out there than I am, but it basically means no meat, no chicken. I do
Okay.
fish. I
Gotcha.
eat fish. I eat eggs. I'm not vegetarian,
Okay.
but
Gotcha.
that's what that is.
Okay. Yeah.
But
So I live in Austin, Minnesota, where the hometown of spam. So I'm asking all my guests if they like spam and keeping a spam count. So I'm gonna have a running spam count from all my guests.
Well, I make no judgments about the
That's
things that
awesome.
people love, and so I would,
Yeah. That's
support
so good.
everybody's right, but not part of my
Not
menu now.
not for you. Gotcha. Well, thank you very much for being on the show. This was great.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It was really great to get to talk with you.
Yeah. To all of you listening, thank you for joining us on this episode of the Inclusive Dad Podcast. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please subscribe, rate, or review the show. Your feedback helps us connect with more champions of inclusion. Remember to share this podcast with friends and family who might benefit. Together, we can make the world more inclusive. Until next time, stay empowered and keep championing inclusion.